Hey, audio team, I've been working on some additions to our show file that we use here at front of house. And I'm excited to share these with you as they go live this weekend. They're going to add a lot to our mixes and how our music sounds on a Sunday. So I'm looking forward to having them fully implemented, and I'm using them week to week. The first thing that we've implemented is the SPD. Instead of having the drummer fire the pads for additional sounds like percussion and that kind of thing, what we're doing is using the drum triggers on the actual drums that we're currently using to fire gates to fire samples from the SPD. So what we've got coming out of the left output of the SPD, we have a kick sample. And coming out the right-hand side of the SPD, we have a snare sample. And these are now part of our layout. So we'll find the kick sample is here, along with the other kick mics, and the snare sample is here. The kick sample is now in the kick DCA, drums DCA. The snare sample is now in the snares DCA and the drums DCA, and is now in the drum mix bus as well. Something to note about the kick sample and the snare sample is they're not going into the parallel bus because of the way they're processed already. They're already processed with parallel processing, which is why they sound as good as they do. So putting them through the parallel bus and processing them like that again makes them a little bit full on. The other thing that we're doing is that we've got, instead of the sub kick mic, what I've done is I've routed the oscillator here in a 40 hertz tone, routed that into the sub kick channel. And so if we just turn on the output there, we see level show up on the sub kick channel. And that's the 40 hertz tone from the tone generator here in the console. And that is gated off the kick trigger. What I've been finding as I've been playing around with this is that I haven't ended up using any of the live kick mics. I've been using the sample and the subtone, and the kick's been sounding really great. I've been using the live snare blended with the sample. The sample still is a fairly significant portion of that blend because of what it adds to the density and the thickness of the snare. The other area where I've made some fairly significant changes is in how we process our vocals. So we've got, first of all, compression on the vocal channel. There are two compressors in line. We have a compressor at 10:1 and we have a compressor at 4:1. So the 10:1 compressor, the attack and release times are super fast. And what that's for is to really pull the peaks off the top of the vocal. This is pretty standard for vocal compression and has been for quite a number of years now in terms of getting a nice tight vocal to sit over a fairly dense musical mix without it sounding and feeling like it's been super compressed. We use this to just take peaks off the top. And so when the vocalist is singing a medium to the loud chorus of a song, then you'll find that it's kind of just chipping away at the top. When the vocalist is really going for it, you'll sometimes get 6 to 10 dB off the top in this compressor, and then that comes into the second compressor, which is compressing at 4:1, more traditional attack release times, and that then compresses the already limited vocal in a way that we much more typically would compress a vocal. And you'll find it's ticking over between like 4 to 6 dB of compression generally, but then when the vocalist goes really hard, you might find you'll get 8, 10, 12 dB of gain reduction. And so between the two compressors, when the vocalist is going really hard, you might get around 20 dB of level off the top of that vocal through the compressors, but there's makeup gain on those compressors to bring level back and raise that floor and get them into that window that we need them in order for them to sit over, as I was saying, a fairly dense musical mix. A couple of things to help out with that is some of the effects that we've added in. I've renamed the vocal delay bus to lead vocal. And the reason for that lead vocal bus is not only now feeding a vocal delay, it is also feeding a tape saturation plugin, which is absolutely cranked. That comes back in to the stereo in here, which is called Vocal Crush. And on that, there's an EQ on the return that's giving us plus 7 dB at 12.5K. And so you're not going to be really just cranking this. There have been some times where it's really been helpful to just bring that lead vocal forward and give them that little bit of presence over the top of, as I was saying, a fairly dense musical mix without having them super loud, because it just brings them forward with that extra presence and that parallel compression from the tape saturation. But there have been other times where I've tried it on certain vocals and it's just been too much. So it's something just to use when you just need to bring that lead vocal forward a little bit and you've got the band mix sitting where you want it, but you just need them just to poke that little bit more. The other thing that we've got going is the vocal doubling. All of the vocals by default are sent to the doubler, and what we have is we have a pitch shift. So there's a left and a right channel. The left channel is slightly sharp by 15% of a semitone, and the left side is slightly flat by 15% of a semitone. What that does is it just slightly pitches up and pitches down whatever's going into it, and it makes the vocal team feel bigger. And then what we do is we're delaying one side by 15 milliseconds, we're delaying the other side by 30 milliseconds. So what that does is it just opens the vocals up across the stereo image. This is one of those things where if you just blend it up and you're just listening to the vocals, you'd be sometimes there pushing the fader up going, it actually just doesn't feel like it's doing anything. I would agree with you, because that's been my experience as well, until you have the band going, you have the vocals going, then you switch it off. And what you hear is the vocal blend just collapses down to the center a little bit and just takes a little bit of a step back. And it's another thing that we can do with the vocals to help them sit and be more present without having them too loud, and helps also round them out and make them a little bit more pleasant at that volume that they need to be where they can be heard. So for the vocal double, I've been running that as just always on the whole time. Even when the worship leader's talking and that kind of thing, you can't really notice that there's that going on. And people are used to having a vocal not sound completely like a speech vocal when it's someone that's out in front of a band. Gone are the days when the worship leader, when they were speaking, just had to be completely dry. We know that there's reverb and stuff on their mics. People are used to that now. We don't need to freak out about that. The other thing that I've done that's been really helpful is I am ducking the late reflections and I'm ducking the vocal delay based off the level of the vocal group. This is another technique that's been fairly common in mixing, probably maybe the last 10 years or so, where as we process vocals more and are building lush, dense textures with our vocals, and we have a lot of reverb and delay that's surrounding them, we can find that when the vocal is singing, that it gets quite muddy. And so the technique that's been used for a while now to get around that is that when the vocal is singing, the reverb and delay get ducked. But then when the phrase finishes, or it's the end of a line or end of a section and the vocal stops, then the reverb and delay get released back up and fill that space. And I think that's going to help us out a lot, because listening back to a lot of mixes that we do, I listen to every service every week. Something that I've observed is that we often mix vocals quite dry and quite stark. So this will help us get our reverb and delay levels up while maintaining intelligibility on the vocals and having a really nice level of ambience and space around the vocal without having that overwhelm the sound of the vocals when all of the vocals are singing at once, or there's a lot of words or anything like that. So that will help a lot in that space. That's everything in this update. I think with the samples on the drums and some of the changes that we've made in vocal processing, I have to say this is probably one of the more exciting updates that we've brought to our mixing workflow. And these are things that are really going to take our drums and our vocals to the next level. If you get your drums and vocals sounding great, then it becomes a lot easier to get everything else fitting in around it. Hit me up if you've got any questions. Make sure you reach out, and look forward to hearing what you guys do with it over the coming weekends.